And today we are marching on through chapter 22. Now, I have a little disclaimer here. This is not for children. There's a lot of things in the Old Testament that they don't teach you in your children's Sunday school class. And this section of chapter 22 is probably one of them. So I just want you to be aware of that as we go forward. Okay. We started chapter 22 and ended at verse 5. The first part had to do with if you see an animal in distress or wandering off, even if it belongs to a neighbor that you despise, you still have to rescue the animal and bring it back to your neighbor. If you don't know who it belongs to, you're supposed to take care of it until someone shows up to claim it. That's kind of an early ASPCA thing. The second one that we just finished with in verse 5 was that a woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. I wonder what that's relevant to. But evidently, it looks like maybe AID was involved with that. So they were dealing with early. We see that fetishes are something that have been part of human history for a long time. Okay, nothing new under the sun. Okay, how we deal with it is different. Back then they would stone you to death. So inappropriate behavior as far as they were concerned. Today we are a little bit more tolerant. Okay, here's some more environmental stuff to take care of flora and fauna. If you come on a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. Let the mother go, taking only the young for yourself, in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. What's that all about?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. This is kind of tied into the kosher thing where you would not boil a kid in its mother's milk. There is a reverence for motherhood in the Old Testament. And it's not just a matter of preserving the species. And I don't understand why they didn't leave an egg in the nest or one of the birds in the nest. That would have been more effective. But what they're saying is that this is a obviously reproducing female bird, and if you kill it, then where are all the eggs and fledglings going to come from? So that was their mindset. It's interesting that they had that kind of consideration. I don't know how pervasive that attitude would be in the general area where the people lived. But in any event, they felt it necessary to preserve the ability to reproduce. It's a big deal for them. And that's why they say that you may live long, because if you don't have that reverence for motherhood, then your society is not going to flourish. And I find that kind of interesting because we've gone through big debates lately over abortion, and it seems like there have been an awful lot of people who would prefer that you not reproduce, that you do everything you can from keeping to reproduce. In fact, there was one female legislator who decided that because of the recent election that she would sterilize herself, and she went ahead and did that. And probably that was a good thing for humanity. But in any event, you can carry these things way too far. But I thought it interesting that you have a life and an anti-life attitude going on within society. Within the United Methodist Church, if you look through our social principles dissuade abortion as much as possible, but recognize that there may be some circumstances where it's defensible. Okay? Don't specify necessarily what those situations are, but they say that this is not it's a huge decision. It has to be taken very carefully and prayerfully, and with the best advice you can get from professionals. So that's the position of the United Methodist Church. It is not totally anti-abortion, but it is leaning very far against it. No abortion because of gender selection, no abortion because of possible birth defects. That's the position of the church.
But then again, it's okay if a woman chooses not to have children.
Yes, yeah, there is that as well.
Because I remember, and my parents' heyday, their Sunday school class, there was a couple that she could not have a baby,
Right.
she could not, get pregnant. And it was like, nobody persecuted her, but I mean, it was that she was affected the rest of her life, because she couldn't have children. And I think it caused mental issues with
Yes.
her. And I think maybe back then it wasn't as.
Oh, it was. If
Now it's not as in your face, but then, you were just kind of looked like, what's wrong with you or whatever.
If you could not bear children in the Old Testament culture, if you couldn't bear children, you were considered cursed. And it was always the woman's fault
Yeah.
that she couldn't bear children. That was the presumption. But if you were capable of bearing children, you basically were cursed if you didn't. And so that attitude of, you have a choice, not necessarily. In the Old Testament, if you could bear children, that was part of your role as a woman to bear children. So, a little different attitude today, more tolerant and less judgmental in many respects. But anyway, what we're looking at in this, just a simple thing about taking eggs out of a nest, you're beginning, you see in that a reverence for motherhood. Okay. Okay, when you build, this is Asha now, early Asha. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Otherwise, you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone fall from it. So if you have, they are all flat roofs, okay? And people would go up on the roof in the evening. That was a cool thing to do. But you had to have some kind of a wall, fence, guardrail, something around your roof as a safety thing. And if you didn't put it up there, you could be held accountable for somebody who died falling from your roof. So
that was the beginning of building code.
yes, that was a building code. That was a building code.
It's
It's
amazing how they throw all these different things into
Yeah.
one. I mean, you go from having babies to building codes, and it all. You
That's
just
it,
throw
but-
in anything you want to.
But it's another strong indicator that this was not written during the Exodus, when they're living in tents. So, they didn't have parapets around the roofs of their tents. So anyway, you shall not, now this gets into some interesting kosher understandings, and I hate to say it, but many of us, even sitting in this room, would not be considered kosher at this point. Just want you to know. Because you shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, or the whole yield would have to be forfeited, both the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard itself. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. You shall not wear clothes made of wool and linen woven together. Okay, what is that all about? Today we do a lot of genetic engineering. That's not kosher. Okay? I think they would be absolutely appalled to know that we replace heart valves with pig valves. That's not kosher. Yeah, that's
I
not
wonder
kosher.
if people today, if they would not even consider that.
A Jew probably wouldn't.
Oh, no, a Jew would not. Neither would a Muslim. There's no way that a Muslim would have any part of a pig implanted in their body.
Wow.
Yeah. But if you have a blended fabric, you're not allowed to have a blended fabric. And it's you wonder about this, but what they're saying is that cross species is not cool, even when it comes to grapes. So what we do in genetic engineering in crops or animal husbandry or that sort of thing, they weren't into that at all. It was this kind of a grape or that kind of a grape, and you didn't put them in the same area with each other. You didn't cross-pollinate. You grew one kind of grape, and that's the kind of grape you grew, and then somebody else might grow another kind of grape, but nobody grew two kinds of grapes. Cross-pollination was not allowed. But it's interesting when the Apostle Paul is talking about God's chosen people and Gentile Christians, that he talks about grafting the Christian community into the Jewish tree or vine.
The vine.
Yeah. So it's kind of, so there was a practice of doing it, and evidently by the time, at least by the time of New Testament period, that people were regularly grafting things on. Different varieties of crop were being grafted on in violation of this. So it's kind of interesting how that, that kind of got thrown by the wayside.
But were Jews, or was it just Gentiles that was doing that?
I'm sure that Gentiles had no problem at all
Right.
with this kind of thing. It's one of the reasons why throughout the Old Testament that the Gentile communities around the Jewish communities were much more technologically advanced. For instance, it would not be cool for a Jew to forge bronze. Okay? You wouldn't put copper and iron together. You wouldn't take two different kinds of metals and blend them together, but the Philistines were doing this all the time. And one of the things that the Jewish community felt like was that when they were doing that, it was a form of magic that they were prohibited from doing. So they were always technologically behind, and even during the wars with the Philistines, if the Jewish community needed more advanced weapons, they had to actually buy them from their adversaries. So, or if they needed a plow or something like that, they would go to a Gentile. You have some records in here, especially you get into the book of Joshua, that you had Gentile artisans that resided within the Jewish community, and they would do the forging. But there's almost nobody in the Jewish community that is skilled in metalwork. So, kind of interesting how that
So
goes.
it's the same as a Jewish person had to marry a Jewish person?
Yes. Yeah, but that didn't always
Theoretically.
happen. Clearly, that didn't always happen. Because when you see, for instance, when the people returned from captivity, they brought with them their Gentile wives, and then they had to divorce them because of the law. Okay? They didn't know the law before they got back to town, and when they got back to town and somebody wrote them the law, then
Yeah.
then I said, oh, well, what am I going to do? And they divorced their Gentile wives. So, bummer. Anyway, the Jewish tradition is that you don't mix things up.
Right, that's what I was.
And I guess that's sort of like telling them, you don't mix with other nations.
Correct.
or
Yeah, the
racist.
whole, that's the whole thing, is that these people are going to be separate. They're going to be pure, okay? They're not going to be contaminated. There's not going to be any cross-pollination, you know? And
And
understand.
that's like, that just, and Jesus just threw all that out the door, right? Right.
Not right away. Okay? Not right away. I've had some, every time the lectionary came around to the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus is pretty racist in that story. And, you know, the question arises, was Jesus a racist? And the answer is, of course, he was Jewish. It's part of Judaism to have distinct races. Okay? And not necessarily to look kindly upon other races. That's all through the Bible. And it's one of the reasons why there's so much racism that persists
Today.
in Judeo-Christian societies. It also exists in plenty of other societies. You don't need the Bible for you to be a racist. I mean, the Japanese were highly racist. You know, I lived in China, and yes, they really are. And they're racist not just against Westerners, they're racist from one province to another. If you have a different dialect in China and you're identified as that, you're the outsider kind of thing. And one of the things that I found very interesting as I moved around, because I was only in one province, but in Taiwan. But when you move around, if you tried some Chinese words, they would correct you in your pronunciation. But if you went to another village, they would correct you about your pronunciation if you used the other one. So, you know.
Well, it's kind of like here, you know,
Yeah.
if you're from the South and you marry a Yankee.
Oh, God.
Or whatever,
Oh,
you know.
who does
God
that?
forbid.
Yeah.
you know, Right?
But yet, last Sunday, we talked about marrying a captive, you know.
Yeah, captive
Yeah,
women.
They could marry a captive
Right.
woman, but if they wanted to divorce her, they couldn't sell. You know, so that apparently wasn't Jewish, that was,
Well, not necessarily. There were battles between tribes. Okay, this was not a republic. This was a confederation, and a lot of people don't realize how unworkable a confederation can be. But just take a look at the European Union. That's a confederation, and you see what they're running into. And of course, they have much worse diversity than we do because you have different languages within the community, and in different countries they're going to speak different languages. You know, we tried Articles of Confederation when we started out, and it simply was an unworkable system. So the one we have now, a republic, is a much more workable system. You know, it's working so far anyway. But yeah, they're you know, racism is inherent in what you read in the Bible. So, I mean, we get really angry at people who we call racist all the time, but just understand that this is part of our Judeo-Christian heritage, is to be racist. And it's something that we're trying to purge, because we understand that we don't really want to maintain that kind of attitude. Jesus started out in that narrative with some very racist comments, but he ended up healing the woman's daughter in spite of that. Jesus said also about the retired centurion that he had tremendous faith, and he said he has more faith than what I've seen in my own people. You know, he had his servant healed, and Jesus commended him on his faith. So you see this inclusiveness. Also, Jesus' first sermon that Kim preached about last Sunday, where he started out real fine, talking about Isaiah, and then he started saying, oh, by the way, why wasn't it a Jewish widow that took care of Elijah, you know, and why wasn't it a Jewish leper that Elisha healed? They stayed with Gentiles and healed Gentiles, and Jesus was pretty critical of his own hometown. You get no special favors. So you see an opening up toward the Gentile community, a recognition of their capacity to have a faith in God, that later on with Peter's vision and with Paul, you see this movement to be much more inclusive with Gentiles, and sometimes dedicated ministries to Gentiles. And Paul was very adamant that the Christian community was not supposed to be exclusive in any way. Pentecost was an indication, but that was primarily to Jews that spoke different languages. So it wasn't inclusive of Gentiles, but it did include Gentile languages. So anyway, just a thought.
Speaking of racism, I was talking to Ann about it yesterday. I can remember growing up that where my father worked, there was a sign that said "white men"
Yeah.
on the bathroom, and they finally took it down, and I kept it. I was going to save it to show our kids, but somehow it got misplaced.
Sarah is putting together a display at Kinston High School, because Kinston High School inherited a number of schools. And she's putting up yearbooks from the time when there was segregation. And she's putting all this on display to show how things have changed over the years, but to recognize that we have in many cases, a past that we should not be proud of. It wasn't the same kind of racism that you all experienced here in the South, but I grew up in New York, and believe me, there was plenty of it. And we didn't just have two groups. We had, if you went through Manhattan, you went from one country to another, and these were all neighborhoods. You could go to the Italian neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood, the Chinese neighborhood. You went from one country to another in Manhattan. The segregation was going on there. And I recall, because I was in high school when desegregation happened, and I remember what it was like. The experience in our high school was almost the inverse of what you had down here, where the greatest hostility was expressed by the minority community. So that was really interesting. But they were coming into new territory, and man, they stood together. And you could.
There was
It was very hard. It was very hard to
segregation.
have a black friend. If you were white, it was very hard to have a black friend when we started this out in a northern high school.
When I started teaching, my first year, it was all black.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught in an all-black school in Wilson. Then there were more teachers than jobs.
Yeah.
Shortage today, but it was not like that back then, because girls couldn't do but certain things, and teaching was one of them. But the last line of the application said, "Will you teach anywhere?" And I put yes. I didn't even interview for the job. I just got a call
Right.
that said and it was an all-black school,
Yeah.
which I had never, I'd never experienced,
Well,
And it
Yeah.
was very interesting. And then when we moved back to Kinston, well, the next year after that in Wilson, they integrated. But then when we moved back to Kinston, they had not integrated the elementary schools. They had done the high school, middle school. And so 4 years, when I taught at Bynum, it was all black students.
yeah. Well, my experience in living in different cultures has been an eye-opener. I've been to several Arab countries, and there's a tremendous amount of prejudice in Arab countries towards non-Arabs. There's a tremendous amount of. It was kind of interesting because I was in Taiwan, and they really appreciated us in Taiwan. They nobody was going to mess with Taiwan when they had American troops there, and at the same time, there were undercurrents that we found you know, where they treated us mostly because of our ability to buy things, okay? But they didn't necessarily like us, and they didn't necessarily like our lifestyle. And I can understand, given the way some of my troops behaved, that they wouldn't. So, you know, Americans, you gotta understand, when you go to another country, you really do represent your country wherever you go, even if you're just going for yourself for a vacation or something like that. I got along with everybody because I treated everybody with respect. I wasn't condescending in any way.
But I bet you did good. I mean, I bet
Yeah,
it was an adjustment for you, but
It was, but it was actually, it was a great experience. And the children, I had long blonde hair
mm-hmm,
and fair skin, and that school in Wilson was in a neighborhood, and this was like 1969, so they hadn't been out around white people. And children I didn't even know would come down the hall and touch me, touch my hair.
yes.
They'd want to sit beside me, and they'd look at my skin.
We have the same experience in China because our children were very blonde, and children would come up to the car and touch their skin, touch their hair. If we went out to eat, they would hand us a menu and take our kids, and we wouldn't see them till the end of the meal. But seriously, God knows what they were eating. But they took them all around the neighborhood and showed them off and everything. I mean, they treated us with great respect, great honor. But I think the primary reason why we got that over there was more than just skin color. I think there is a perception when an American goes to another country, especially a less developed country, that here's a person who can get something done. You know? That's the perception that people have of Americans. We're the ones who get things done. And I remember taking a mission team to Anguilla, and the guys in Anguilla, the men, are basically unemployed. There's no work out there in the Caribbean. And I mean, you can't get a construction job unless you have your own tools. We left all our tools there with the church so that they could loan them out to guys so that they could get a job. But the men were resentful the fact that we came in, wealthy white people, to build their church when they're unemployed. Why didn't we just hire them to build the church? That is a good question, okay? But one of the reasons for the mission trip was to get an interaction between the cultures so that we would understand each other better. And we had one lady there on our team, and her name was Winnie. And Winnie was like in her 50s. And she got up there on the construction site, and she was moving cement blocks. And just as fast as we could get her a cement block, she would move it. Now, she wasn't, hefty, but she was effective. She grabbed those blocks and off she went. And the men from the community were looking at her, and they had never seen a white woman work. And they were shamed. And they got in there and started moving blocks, and they tried to see if they could outwork her. Okay? And we finally had a good team working together on the church, but it was because of Winnie moving blocks. There's an awful lot to overcome throughout the world. There's a tremendous amount of racism. There's some racism here in this country, not nearly as much as there has been, not nearly as much as we're being accused of. And there is a concerted effort in our culture to try and diminish these kinds of differences. But in other cultures, that's not so much the case. And you just take a look at what went on when Yugoslavia dissolved, and those people were, they looked the same. You could go from a Christian to a Muslim community, and you couldn't tell the difference in the way people looked. They were all intermingled and everything, and it just, but the divisions were horrible. Anyway, the Jewish community in the Old Testament, no blending, keep things pure, always know what you're dealing with, one way or the other. That was the way they were going at it. Okay, we're not getting into the really nasty stuff. I'm sorry, I'm saving that for next week. We're going to start at verse 13, appropriately. And it has to do with virginity before marriage. Okay, so once again, we're going to be PG at least. So watch out, because next week some of this stuff is just, we would consider it bizarre today. So just be aware of that and how they dealt with things. But God bless you all, and thank you for being with us this morning. Hope your journey goes well.
Thank you.
You too.